Hey guys, how's it going? It's Mark Torkus here. So 2019 just came to a close. It's 2020 now, we have Galacrons running around everywhere, and I thought it'd be a good idea to look back at the year and see the meta as it evolved from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So basically what I want to do with this video is I want to break down the metas that happened throughout the year and take a look at the decks that really had an impact. Given how I can't really go off my memory because it's a little difficult, I did end up using Tempo Storm's meta snapshots for basically reminding me of what the metas were looking like throughout the year, so I will leave a link down below in the description if you'd like to check those out. I did look around a lot for resources that have a time capsule of the metas throughout Hearthstone's history, but they're basically the only ones who make them, so I kind of had to go with that. However, there is a bit of a caveat in that I don't have a super high opinion of Tempo Storm's views of the meta. Their snapshots generally don't really match up with the statistics we have elsewhere, like on HS Replay and other such sites. I'm fairly certain their tier lists are just based on their so-called expert opinions and so forth. And given the content that I've seen out of them recently, such as their card review for Descent of Dragons, I've got to say I don't think they're super in touch with what's going on in Hearthstone right now. So basically I just used it to jog my memory, and I won't be going too deep into tier lists or anything like that, but I still will be touching on the decks that did have quite an impact on the meta. Alright, let's get into it. So the year started off about a month after the release of Rostakon's Rumble. There were some nerfs just a couple weeks before that hit Wild Growth, Nourish, Level Up, Serenite Chain Gang, and Leeching Poison. The nerfs basically removed Kingsbane Rogue from the meta, given that Leeching Poison no longer gave it infinite healing. And Shutterwalk Combo Shaman left the meta as well, given that it was no longer able to do an infinite combo off of duplicating itself any longer. Druid was also forced to find new ways to build without relying so much on Wild Growth and Nourish, which had been staples for them basically as long as Druid had been in existence. And at this time, the meta was just absolutely dominated by Hunters. Mid-range Hunter was the most consistently strong deck in the meta pretty much all the way up to the rise of Shadow's expansion. The deck had very strong early game with the power of Crackling Razor Maw and Scavenging Hyena, the draw engine of Master's Call, and the late game value of Deathstalker Rexar. Deathstalker Rexar was such a powerful card, in fact, that it was used effectively in pretty much every Hunter deck that was in the meta. Many people were finding it very frustrating to face, especially given that you were never really sure what zombies might come out of your opponent's hero power, and they were calling for nerfs for a long time, though that never did actually come about. Secret Hunter was also a very powerful Hunter archetype. The secrets were played to power up the Emerald Spellstone, and then you would have big tempo swings on turn 5 where you get your 4 3/3s at the same time. Then Zul'jin was used as the finisher for that deck, where it would refill their board and give them the full complement of secrets all over again. Spell Hunter was also around, which was very similar to Secret Hunter, although it just replaced the minions that it had instead with spells, so that it would be able to leverage the power of Rockdalar, which was the Hunter legendary weapon that gave you a total full hand of spells whenever you played it. And finally, the fourth Hunter deck that was in the meta at the time, we had Death Rattle Hunter, and its main thing was to use Play Dead and Terror Scale Stalker to trigger the death rattles of their cards. They would use Devilsaur Eggs early on, which would give them the 5/5s that would keep them in the game until they were able to transition into finding finishers using chargers like Charge Devilsaur and King Crush, which could be duplicated and cheated out using cards like Katharina Winterwisp and Carnivorous Cube. It also had Witchwood Grizzly and Ziliax, which would be used to help you stay alive until that late game point, and could also be duplicated to help you get through those tough situations. Outside of Hunters, we had Odd Warrior, which sometimes ran the quest, sometimes didn't. The hero power that Odd Warrior was given was strong enough to shut down those aggressive decks in the early game, and then they could transition into Dr. Boom Mad Genius in the late game, and that would give them their constant removal by using their rushing mechs, and then also the value of their hero power would keep them going way into the late game. Despite the level up nerf, Odd Paladin was also managing to adapt and stay relatively strong. Level up had been replaced by Frostwolf Warlord, but the important cards that had always been there were still there, like Fungalmancer and Corridor Creeper. We also had Even Paladin, which was doing very well with their hero power being cheap, so they could put their Blessing of Kings and their Spike Ridge Deeds on these constantly available 1/1s. They would use Corpse Takers as huge early game bombs that were must remove cards, given that they were being buffed with Wind Fury by the Wind Fury Harpies, run specifically for this purpose, just so that if you were able to hit your Blessing of Kings on the card, it would just snowball out of control and end the game very quickly. And Paladin even had their Death Knight OTK deck, which was using Brewmasters and Zola the Gorgon to set up for adding enough horsemen into their hand that they could drop all 4 horsemen for their instant kill of their opponent. Priests had a couple strong decks in Resurrect OTK Priest, as well as their Dragon Control Priest. Resurrect Priest was actually one of my favorite decks at the time, and you would use your Cloning Gallery to summon all of your minions, and you'd have Diamond Spellstone so you could bring them back, setting up for lethals with Mind Blast combined with Malagos, Prophet Velen, and Radiant Elementals. The Control Priest was using dragon synergies like Duskbreaker and Twilight Acolyte, which you would combine with Cabal Shadow Priest. Basically, the idea was to make it to the late game, where you would play your Shadow Reaper Anduin, and you'd use the hero power combined with Alexstrasza and the Mind Blast to finish off your opponent once they were low on health. For Warlocks, we had Even Warlock, which was using its hero power that was very cheap, so that they could set up for very early Mountain Giants and Hooked Reavers, which were pretty big bombs that needed removal quite quickly. Q-Block was also still around, which had Skull of the Minari and would summon out Doom Guards and Void Lords. They could use their Carnivorous Cubes to duplicate their demons, and then once you use Blood Reaver Gul'dan, you would get all those demons back, and you could push for lethal with multiple Doom Guards all at once. For Shamans, we had Even Shaman, which was very similar to how Even Paladin was working, and also used Corpse Taker the same way, although it was in synergy with Alakir, which was a much better synergistic tool, as it was actually a good Wind Fury minion, so that you didn't have to be running things like Wind Fury Harpy to get that synergy. Finally, we had Odd Rogue, which was basically the aggro staple of the meta, and it utilized a lot of very powerful tempo cards in combination with its powered up rogue hero power, which was always pretty much the best tempo hero power of them all anyways. Often the curve you had to worry about was them hitting their hero power on 2 and then dropping that Hench Clan Thug, which would just go out of control if not dealt with, while they were also keeping your minions off the board with that strong hero power. Meanwhile, Druid was struggling after the nerfs. They were starting to find their footing with some Auctioneer-based draw engines. There were new versions of Togwaggle, Malagos, and Takar Miracle Druids, but they had not yet managed to start climbing up the ladder, really. The mages that were around at the time were odd mages, and there were both aggressive and slower variants of that, though none of them had really reached their full potential in the current meta that they were experiencing at the time. So really what we had at this time was a meta that was dominated by even and odd decks, as well as hero cards in so many of the decks that were powerful at the time. We did see the tournament scene have a little bit of an effect on the meta as well, in that people started to realize that maybe the Holy Wrath Paladin that had not yet become very popular was perhaps just a better alternative to the Death Knight OTK deck, and that kind of took over that position in the meta for a bit. So moving into February, we finally saw some nerfs to the strong decks that were happening at the time. As is sometimes the case, the previous nerfs had really been to address problems that had already been there before the expansion, and these new nerfs were to deal with the problems that had actually come up during this expansion. So the nerfs that we saw Cold Blood for Odd Rogues go from 1 mana to 2, thereby removing it from the deck, given that it was no longer odd. We saw Even Shaman's Flametongue Totem move up to 3 mana, which had the same effect on that deck. And then for Hunters, we saw their Hunter's Mark go from 1 mana to 2, as well as Lesser Emerald Spellstone was moved from 5 mana to 6. And finally, Equality was brought from 2 mana to 4. These nerfs were enough to effectively drop Odd Rogue, Even Shaman, and most Paladin decks, at least those that were relying on Equality, down in win rate significantly, and their popularity with it. Secret Hunter and Spell Hunter also effectively dropped off the map because of the fact that they were the ones relying on Spellstone, and the other hunters just managed to deal with the nerf to Hunter's Mark and kept going from there. Because of this shift in power, Druid and Mage both saw an opening in the meta now, and both became much more better performing classes overall. Meanwhile, Odd Warrior actually saw a decrease in win rate, purely because of the fact that many of the aggressive decks that had been nerfed had lost popularity, and now its matchups were much less favorable than they had been before. At this time, we also started to see a rise in a new deck in Wall Priest, which was focused on creating very large taunts and reviving them repeatedly until one stuck, and they were able to pull off their Divine Spirit Inner Fire combo that would finish off their opponents. Despite the changes, Mid-Range Hunter did continue to stay on top and continued to be there until Rise of Shadows was released. Obviously, the first expansion of every year is when rotation happens, and we rotate out one whole year of expansions. So with this rotation, it's a very large change to the meta, but this time, even more than ever, it was so huge because of the fact that Blizzard decided to rotate out Gen and Baku as well, 1 year ahead of their normal rotation time. This was an unprecedented choice on Blizzard's part, and I believe that it was a very good idea, given that another year of odd and even decks would have been quite stale, to be honest. So Rise of Shadows came out. Immediately upon the start of the expansion, it became very clear that Tempo Rogue was on a crazy power level. Personally, I fell in love with it, and I got to Legend for the first time with this deck. I had never really made an effort before, but this deck was very good, and it was when I was doing a little bit of streaming at the time, so I really got into it and had a lot of fun with it too. The combo of Preparation into Raiding Party for 0 mana draw 3 was absolutely insane, especially when combined with Edwin, which would leave you with a 8/8 after that draw 3, an incredibly powerful tempo push. all at the same time. Many players expected that lackeys would be pretty good in the expansion to come, but they had no idea how powerful. And Evil Miscreant really was the highlight of lackeys as a mechanic and was an amazing card. In direct opposition to Tempo Rogue, though, we had Control Warrior rising to oppose it. Outside of Archivist Elysiana, which was the card that would allow them to win in fatigue by shuffling more cards in, there really weren't any new cards that were being run. It was just a very solid control shell that had been left over from Boomsday and other expansions. However, Bomb Warrior was making use of a new mechanic and using new cards like Wrench Caliber and Blastmaster Boom to very strong effect. Token Druid also made quite a big entrance into the meta, and it stayed quite powerful for a while, though it did weaken a little bit as the meta settled down. We saw Mage finding success with Conjurer Mage, which was a dragon deck with very few spells outside of Conjurer's Calling and Book of Specters, and it would have the game plan of getting down Mountain Giants early on and then hitting them with the Conjurer's Calling to make large, wide boards that were hard to deal with. For Warlock, we saw an aggressive Zoo build, which was using cards like Magic Carpet and Evil Genius. It would also generally run Archvillain Reform as their late game Hail Mary when you run out of gas and you just fill your deck with legendaries and hope for the best from there. Mech Hunter saw some experimentation with a slow version using Mechanical Whelps and Oblivitrons for lots of value and creating many large minions. But eventually it came about that a more aggressive version seemed to be the better option with cards like Boommaster Flark, which would give you many magnetic options and have lots of damage potential. So we had all these new decks, but the only deck that really managed to survive the rotation was, of course, Midrange Hunter. Though it did transition into a game plan that was much less aggressive in the early game, and it was much more based around gaining big value from Dire Frenzy, and then using Zul'jin in the late game to outvalue and outlast your opponents. There was a Miracle Mage that was finding some experimentation at these early stages of the meta, but eventually the Mana Cyclone idea would be transitioned over to the Conjure Mage, and they would drop their dragon packages in exchange for this Cyclone idea, so that Mana Cyclone Mage and Conjure Mage would become Cyclone Conjure Mage, effectively. And we also saw Nomi Priest become a thing. The game plan of that deck was to use Auctioneer and Northshire Cleric to draw through your deck very quickly and then drop your Chef Nomi at the end as a gigantic board that would be hard to deal with. You could also use Seance to get 2 more copies, so that even if your opponent somehow managed to deal with the first wave, they would still have to deal with 2 more waves of Nomis before they'd be able to survive. Though it was a very strong deck, and other decks like it that plan revolved around drawing very quickly were also very good, their success was tempered by the popularity of Bomb Warrior, always shuffling bombs into their decks and making it very hard to survive drawing all the way to the bottom of your deck in those matchups. So that's what we were seeing then. We eventually got to the middle of May, where we did see some balance changes hit that were to address Tempo Rogue. So Raiding Party was increased from 3 mana to 4. Preparation now only decreased the mana of spells by 2 rather than 3. And Evil Miscreant went from 5 health to 4. These changes pretty much killed the current iteration of Tempo Rogue given that Raiding Party and Preparation were no longer good enough to make the cut, and that was the main crux of what the deck was doing at the time. However, it did manage to continue to survive because it would start to run more thief cards that were very powerful together, and it would begin to use the Spirit of the Shark, which would give you a lot of value off of your Miscreants, your Lackeys, and Edwin, and so forth. At the same time, we saw Archivist Elysiana also change from 8 mana to 9, not really because it was a powerful card, but because of the fact that it was creating insane long multi-Elysiana Control Warrior matchups that were just far too extended for anyone's liking. As someone who was playing in the Masters qualifiers at the time, we were in a specialist meta where everyone would get to run one deck, and Control Warrior was actually very popular at the time. So I can definitely attest to the ridiculous match lengths that were happening in our Swiss tournaments, where everyone gets to stay in the tournament after their first loss, and they're matching up into other Control Warriors who are all running multiple Elysiana combos. This would lead to tournaments sometimes lasting as long as 17 hours or so. And I was in one of those too. It was just absolutely disgusting. And thank goodness they changed it, because it definitely did decrease match length significantly. Though Control Warrior was still about as popular, maybe a little bit less, it did significantly decrease the amount of multiple Elysianas, because most people weren't running ways to bounce it any longer, given that the mana didn't line up that way. On ladder, though, we did see Control Warrior become weaker because of the decrease in popularity of Rogue at the time, as that was its best matchup, but it did still hold a pretty good position in the meta. With less warriors, we did see decks like Murloc Shaman and Holy Wrath Paladin managing to move up in the meta, given that that would be one of their worst matchups. So the meta stabilized again for a little while until we did see the Rise of the Mech event, which was another first for Blizzard, and it was the first time we had ever seen buffs to cards basically since beta. There were many buff cards all across the Boomsday expansion, as well as they added Snip Snap to the game. For the most part, this event didn't actually change the meta outside of some cards being integrated into decks that were already successful. Snip Snap did find a place in many decks due to its ability to be strong in lots of situations, the power of its Echo and its Magnetic made it very flexible. Luna's Pocket Galaxy did become a very strong inclusion in the Cyclone Giants Mage, and did make that much more powerful than it already was. That change to Thunderhead did cause an aggro Overload Shaman to come about, which utilized Doom Hammer and Rockbiter Weapon in combination for big burst damage finishers. So with the meta stable again, we saw some time pass until Saviors of Uldum was released. So this year was very cool because it had the through line of a story through all 3 expansions. The first one with the villains in Rise of Shadows. Now we had the heroes, which for Saviors of Uldum, they were the explorers that came about in the League of Explorers expansion years ago. We saw the return of Highlander as a mechanic, having no duplicates in your deck, and we also saw the return of quests. Upon the expansion's release, the quests did not seem to be very successful as of yet. Going into the expansion, Cyclone Mage, Bomb Warrior, Control Warrior, and Tempo Rogue all stayed in a strong position. Combo Priest came out swinging. It had these aggressive openers where you would set up these mid-sized minions that you keep healing, and then you would snowball into getting Divine Spirit and Inner Fire combos to finish off your opponent. The main heavy hitters of that deck were High Priest Ahmet, which would immediately become a incredible threat once it was on the board, because every time you would play a minion, you would get 7 health, maybe more if you buffed up the Ahmet as well. And also, the card that was buffed in the Rise of the Mech event, Extra Arms, was also very helpful in keeping this deck going. Highlander Hunter and Highlander Mage would come out as the 2 Highlander decks that started out doing very well, and they were utilizing both of their Highlander heroes for their classes, as well as Zephyrus, which would become basically renowned as one of the best cards ever in the game after this point. Zephyrus being this card that literally discovers you the perfect card for your situation. It's pretty good. Murloc Paladin became a very strong deck due to this synergy that it had between Prismatic Lens and Tip the Scales, so that you could swap the costs of a cheap Murloc with the 8 mana Tip the Scales. You could end up having a 1 mana Tip the Scales, fill your board with Murlocs. It was quite a swing. Though the funny thing is that it never really became that popular. It was just always one of those decks that was very strong and just on the fringes of the meta. Since we had many strong decks carrying over from the meta before this expansion, the Blizzard balance team did see the need to throw in some nerfs, of course. So Conjurer's Calling was changed from 4 mana to 3 mana to combat the power of the Cyclone Mage, as well as Luna's Pocket Galaxy was reverted from its buff state of 5 mana back to its original state of being at 7 mana. Dr. Boom was changed from 7 mana to 9 mana, and Extra Arms was also reverted back from 2 mana to the original 3 mana. After these nerfs, mages were effectively pushed out of high level play. Combo Priest did manage to survive the nerf, basically unscathed, aside from a little bit weaker in its ability to snowball its early game. However, Control Warrior and Bomb Warrior took a big hit, and it did not take long for them to also be banished to the fringes of the meta. The effect of Dr. Boom had just been so strong on 7, and now that they were at 9, it was a little slow for them to keep up with the faster decks that they'd be dealing with. So as with any shifts, they brought about more decks into prominence, as you would expect. Temple Warrior was a deck that came about with Bloodsworn Mercenary and Temple Berserker being the powerhouses that really put on the pressure in the early game. Bloodsworn Mercenary was able to make some big plays in conjunction with Inner Rage and cards like that, such as Cruel Taskmaster, and you could use that on your cards like Leroy Jenkins to get big combo finishers. And we did start to finally see some quests find some success in Quest Druid and Quest Shaman. Quest Druid did have to not spend all of their mana for the first few turns of the game, so they were on a back foot, just attempting to live through the aggression, and then once they finished their quest, they would be able to drop giant bombs like Cenarius. Then they would be able to multiply the threats that they had once they start running dry, because they would run Elise the Enlightened, once their deck no longer had duplicates anymore. Quest Shaman was mostly a minion-based deck that had very many battle cries, and you'd be able to gain both tons of crazy value, and you'd have some of these crazy burst damage finishers with Life Drinker and Weaponized Wasp that would finish people off from pretty high health totals once you use that double Battlecry hero power. As time passed, Temple Warrior started to split a bit, and we started to see a separate version, which was the Highlander version, and this also became a very effective deck in the meta. And then this is when we finally saw another thing that had never happened before. This is clearly a very big year for Hearthstone. There are crazy things happening. all throughout the year. So we saw the Doom in the Tomb event. This was when they decided to bring back a decent amount of strong wild cards that had been rotated out in the past. Funny thing is that despite much experimentation with builds such as like N'Zoth, Warlock, and such, similar to the Rise of the Mech event, we didn't see a lot of changes in the meta. It was mostly just the same decks that were already on top, adding new additions to what they were already running. A good exception to this, though, was Highlander Paladin. Highlander Paladin became a successful deck due to the fact that their secret package had come back in this Avenge secret and the Mysterious Challenger. Mysterious Challenger is obviously a very infamous card that was around during the Grand Tournament expansion. A lot of cards started running the staple legendaries that we'd had in the classic set for so long until they were Hall of Famed with Sylvanas and Ragnaros. The aggro shamans and quest shamans that had already been popular started running Evolve and synergistic cards such as Mogu Flesh Shaper, and that would just create insane early game boards that was starting to tilt a lot of players. Quest Druid got Kun the Forgotten King, which on the turn you played it was an amazing tempo and healing tool that spiked the power of the deck significantly. Once we got to BlizzCon time, Sathravar was added to the set early, ahead of the release of Descent of Dragons, and it was a good addition to the Quest Druid. You would be able to hit the Kun with it and get multiple Kuns. Given that that was probably the best card in the deck already, that was very powerful. It was also an extremely powerful tool for Holy Wrath Paladin in combination with Shirvala, and that propelled Holy Wrath Paladin back into the meta as quite a force. And then things stayed relatively the same from that point up until we finally saw the last expansion of the year, Descent of Dragons. Obviously the big thing for this expansion was supposed to be dragons, though we didn't really see a lot of dragons come into the meta from it. It was mostly just hyped up and didn't really follow through with that. But what we did see a lot of was Galakrond. All 5 of the evil classes got Galakrons of their own that all did different things. And it took less than a day for everyone to realize that Galakrond Shaman was the best one, and it was the most dominant deck we have ever seen on release ever. The thing with Galakrond Shaman was it was just so fast, and you had the quest version, you had the aggro overload type version as well, but it became clear that the best version was just the one that ran extra card draw, that let you draw into your Galakrond cards faster, so you could get that turn 7 fully invoked Galakrond, double 8/8s. It's just insane. After a few days passed, it started to become apparent that Holy Wrath Paladin was a pretty good match for it, because you just wait out all of the big plays that they do, you deal with that Galakrond, and then you do your combo finisher at the end. But despite that, it still wasn't that great of a matchup, and it was really the only matchup that Galakrond Shaman was losing. Outside of the Holy Wrath Paladin matchup, their lowest matchup was themselves at 50%. Other decks we saw come onto the scene were like Pirate Warrior, that was quite strong with the new legendary weapon. Ankar gave you tons of draw to get through all of your pirates and get them all out there, something that you couldn't really do in the past with your warrior decks. Highlander Hunter also stayed quite a strong deck with this new tool of Dragon Queen Alexstrasza in the late game, where you get your big dragon and then 2 free dragons, which would hopefully be similarly large in size and would be quite a large swing on that turn. And also a few days into the meta, we saw a new Face Hunter, which was using the side quest to get the Leper Gnomes and lots of face damage cards that would try to finish off your opponent very quickly, but didn't really focus too much on staying on board. There were very few minions in the deck. But really, most decks were having a lot of trouble shining in this current meta that they were having because Galakron Shaman was so dominant and countering all the things that they were trying to do. So when it was announced that nerfs would be coming only a week into the expansion to deal with this Shaman incursion, it was very pleasant news for sure. So the nerfs we saw were Corrupt Elementalist going from 5 mana to 6 mana. We saw Sludge Slurper and Faceless Corruptor losing 1 attack. And we saw Mogu Flesh Shaper go from 7 mana to 9 mana. Faceless Corruptor had already been a staple in pretty much any deck that can stick a minion of any kind. And it continued to be that even after its nerf. It had been totally overtuned, to be honest. After these nerfs, Galakron Shaman kind of just stayed one of the most strong decks still, though it finally managed to become weak enough that other decks really had a chance to shine. The Galakron Shamans did have to change their deck list a little bit, become more interesting with using cards like Zentimo and Spirit of the Frog, instead of just going all out on getting that Galakron going. It wasn't really enough for that to happen anymore. Rogue was one of the most oppressed classes by the Galakron Shamans, so it really started coming about once these nerfs hit. We saw Death Rattle Rogues utilizing Necrium Apothecary, which was quite a strong card, and it would either activate Anubisath Warbringers, which gives you 3/3 hand buffs to all of your minions, or alternatively, you had the Mechanical Whelps, which would summon you 7/7s for the immediate tempo instead. Galakron Rogue was a decent deck, but it didn't really keep up as much as the other Rogue archetypes. But it was really when Highlander Galakron Rogue came about that was the most prominent and dominant Rogue archetype. Galakron Warrior also had a huge impact on the ladder, with Scion of Ruin being such a powerful tool, almost the only real reason you need to be running this deck, because you could build your whole list around getting more Scions of Ruin, and that would be a win condition in itself, beyond just the damage that the Invokes were putting out and the buffs that the Battlecry of the Galakron would be giving you as well. Treant Token Druid started being able to keep up with decks that were on the scene with their new Treant cards, and we also saw Galakron Zoo Warlock having lots of success with their demon summoning tools and the normal zoo cards that you'd expect, like Sea Giant and Knife Juggler as well. You also had Hand Warlock being a pretty decent deck, which was running the normal Mountain Giants and then lots of dragons for those dragon synergies. Some of the lists were even running Malagos in combination with cards like Soulfire, which would be able to finish out games when you started to get close enough to getting those health totals down, having hit them already with your Mountain Giants and such. And Quest Resurrect Priest, also a deck that existed in the past and never really became that successful, finally coming about as a powerful deck where you summon a bunch of powerful taunts and healing cards and then resurrect them repeatedly, and the hero power that you get from the quest making them so big that the one minion surviving would be enough to finish out the game by itself. And that's where we're at today. And we are now finally hearing about more nerfs coming to the meta now that it's settled down. They're expected to hit Galakron decks as well as Death Rattle Rogue and Pirate Warrior, since those decks are quite strong right now. But for now, this is where we're at. Oh my goodness, that was exhausting. Let me tell you guys, going back and going through the meta of an entire year, sorting out what was good, what's worth mentioning, it was a lot of work. So I really hope you enjoyed watching it. Let me know if you want to see more retrospective looks at other previous years of Hearthstone's history in future videos. And also let me know what your favorite decks, metas, or strategies were in 2019 in the comments below. Please show your support by liking and subscribing to my channel. You can also watch my stream at twitch.tv/morktorkus. The link is in the description. And thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.